It's just, you'd think your teacher would actually make a mark on his paper somewhere and remember where he left off, but he often forgets to do that. So, all right, so we're under the title, and what I generally do is I pull the chapter up on my computer and I read through it several times, and sometimes I use the headings of Bible Gateway that they put on their scriptures. Sometimes I change them. Sometimes I add. I just kind of try to put a title that sums up what's under the paragraph. So that's what I've done all the way through the book of Matthew, so just so you know that. So this section is called Pilate's Strategy to Release Jesus and the Choice of the People. And you will see why I've titled it that way as we go through it. So it says, now at the Passover, or now at the feast, which was the Passover, right? The governor was accustomed to release for the people any prisoner whom they wanted. Remember, at this point, they're wanting to, the Jews, they're wanting to do away with Jesus, right? And they've stirred up the crowd and all of that. And but Pilate has actually questioned Jesus, right? That's what we saw starting in verse 11. We talked about the fact that he asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And of course, Jesus said, "It is as you say." In other words, you're right on the money. That's exactly who I am. And he's already attested to that to the Sanhedrin. He said, I am the Son of God. And of course they declared blasphemy. And last week we talked about the blasphemy. And it's not blasphemy to the Romans, so they can't get a conviction on the basis of that. So they are presenting him. The reason why Pilate asked, "Are you the King of the Jews?" is because that was the accusation, obviously, that the Sanhedrin was making before the Roman court, because that would be sedition and that would be punishable by death, which is what they wanted to seek, the death penalty. So that gets us down to where we are now. And another thing in that paragraph was the fact that Jesus wouldn't answer. They were making all kind of accusations, but he would not answer because prophetically he was not to answer. According to Isaiah 53, he was like a lamb before the slaughter, and he was not going to answer because that was where he was headed, right? The cross. That was his goal. That's why he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Lord, let this cup pass from me." And the cup represented something real bad, right? It represented death. And so he didn't say anything. He was ready to go to the cross for the world. And so Pilate tries to get Jesus out of this. He doesn't really want to convict a man that's not guilty. And so it says, now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. Now, I don't know, maybe Jonathan knows, I don't know of any historical documents that say that this was Pilate's rule. This is, as far as I know, this is the only place in history that we know. The Bible records that this was his leaning, Pilate, to let somebody go, and that was to gain favor with the Jews, who he really didn't care for. Pilate didn't, but he had to get along to rule over them, So it says in verse 16, at that time they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Now, Barabbas obviously is infamous because of this situation. That's why everybody knows who Barabbas is. All Christians know who Barabbas is because he is recorded in this story. Again, I don't know historically that we know anything more about Barabbas than we see in the Scriptures. But the speculation is that Barabbas, because some of the words used in some of the Gospels gives you the idea that maybe Barabbas was not just a thief. Barabbas actually was an insurrectionist. In other words, he was trying to stir up trouble against the Roman government. And there's also speculation, and we don't know this for sure, but there is some speculation that there were 3 people arrested for this, and since Barabbas was released, Jesus took his place. And so those 2 guys on the sides of him were Barabbas' sidekicks. And they were receiving the due penalty for what they had been doing, trying to stir people up against the Roman government. And so that adds a little bit to the whole story of them railing against him, but one of them actually repenting right there on the cross and turning to Christ, that I think Luke records. Matthew doesn't record that. And so when the people, hold on just a second. Yeah, so probably what the situation is, as the note says down here at the bottom of your page 2, Pilate didn't like the Sanhedrin. I think we can understand that, right? We can kind of relate to that from what we've seen of the Sanhedrin to this point. They weren't very spiritual folks, right? They were unsaved. They were basically crooks. They held really what equaled in our day a political position, because their Sanhedrin was kind of their government, their Supreme Court, and they used that to make money. Odd, isn't it? You never see that in human history, right? No man that's ever been in power has ever used it to make money, It seems to be rampant in our day, in our country. That's the heartbreak of, as you look at how we were founded and how we developed as a nation and how God blessed us, to see that we are like all other nations in that today. It's just sickening. Anyway, we won't tarry on that idea. It says, so when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, whom do you want me to release for you? So Pilate is wanting to irritate the Sanhedrin, and he's believing, because this guy's a real bad guy, Barabbas, and these are apparently religious people, because they're there because a religious person is being put on trial. He believes that given the option, they're going to choose Jesus. I really believe that's what he thought. And of course, and by the way, this is something that needs to be changed on your notes, so I won't be accused of heresy. On page 3, toward the top on the left-hand side, I was thinking Pilate, I wrote Jesus. Jesus did not have a wife, and I do not believe that he had a wife, okay? Just get that out there. I'm not a heretic, so please scratch that out so nothing gets copied and passed on to somebody else at some point. Y'all could use that against me someday. So he's thinking, so Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ, he said, who is called the Messiah. For he knew that because of envy, they had handed him over. So who was envious? The religious leaders were envious, right? While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, have nothing to do with that righteous man. For last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him. Again, this is a This is a historical statement that we really don't know anything else about but what it says in Scripture. So we don't know if this was a supernatural thing, that God gave her a dream and gave Pilate one more chance to do the right thing. There's just no way of knowing. That's a possibility, but we don't know for sure. So it says, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. But the governor said to them, which of the two do you want me to release for you? And they said, Barabbas. So again, this is, these guys have been plotting ever since very early on in Jesus' ministry. They had to get rid of him. They tried all kinds of ways to get him to answer. They were constantly trying to test him, to get him to answer in a way that one group or another would get mad at him. Even ask him about, in Matthew 19, they ask him about marriage and divorce and, that type of thing to try to apparently get him in trouble with King Antipas. And so they have been conniving, we would call it, from very early on in his ministry to try to get him out of the way. And several times it basically said they were wanting to kill him. They wanted to do away with him. Well, they finally got a situation, and they have enough pull among these people that have gathered to convince them to ask for Barabbas. Now, do you think the religious people loved Barabbas?
No.
Well, no, that's not, this is all about killing Jesus. They could care less about Barabbas. And so Pilate said to them, then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? So one of the commentators mentioned this, and I think it's probably accurate. What Pilate has done to this point seems to be leaning toward trying to get Jesus off the hook, and again, I think it's totally motivated by his disdain for the Sanhedrin. Jesus means nothing to him, and so he wants to get back at the Sanhedrin, and he finally does to a certain degree when he puts above on his cross that he was King of the Jews. That really stung, But here he's trying to get him off the hook, and I think when he says, "Then what shall I do with Jesus?" I think he's wanting them to say something lesser than the death penalty. But unfortunately, again, the crowd had influence from the religious leaders, and they yelled, "Crucify him." And he said, "What evil has he done?" In other words, I think Pilate was probably trying to be a just judge. He's questioning. He sees nothing legally. If this was a valid court, nothing legally that would convict him of anything according to Roman law. And so, as he says, what evil has he done? In other words, why would these people want him crucified? Pilate saw him as innocent. I think that's very clear here. But they kept shouting all the more, saying, "Crucify him." And one of the things that the Romans that ruled over, the Jews were, they were not easy to rule over, right? Eventually they were so rebellious that 40 years later, Titus had to come in and surround Jerusalem and starve them out and destroy the city. And many of you have probably seen the movie also where the zealots went down to Masada and went up on Masada and of course Masada was Herod's mountaintop retreat area, and it had one little bitty what they call the snake trail. How many did you walk up the snake trail? Did you go to Masada, or did you take the trolley?
No, I walked.
Did you really? Now I'm embarrassed because I took the trolley.
Oh,
Yeah. But I should have walked. But you know, they went down there, and if you've seen the movie Masada, which is a great old movie, you know, they eventually built that ramp and busted through, and they had all committed suicide. So anyway, all of that stuff happened. The Jews didn't want to be ruled over by the Romans. And so my point is, they were always causing problems. And even somebody like Pilate, at this point, to placate the crowd so they didn't cause problems, he gave in. But of course, when he gave in, he washed his hands. And of course, remember, that was symbolic of, I don't see him guilty. This is basically what he's saying. I don't see him guilty, but I'm going to let him be crucified, but that's your decision. And this almost brings me to tears thinking about this, because the Jewish people had absolutely no idea the repercussions of what they were doing. If they had, they would not have said what they're about to say. When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, it was just causing the crowd to go mad. But rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves. And what did the Jewish people say? And all the people said, his blood shall be on us and our children. And that generation got wiped out, basically. The ones that survived, you know, not starving to death in Jerusalem and not getting killed by a Roman soldier, were marched back to Rome and sold, and were dispersed all over the world. Just exactly, you know, we're always reading that passage in Deuteronomy 28 and 29, and it talks about the fact that they're going to be dispersed all over everywhere because they are going to violate the Mosaic Law. Now, remember, that was given way back at the Mount Sinai. And they were dispersed from that point until the late 1800s, when they started traveling back there and settling, and then became a state in 1948. Almost 1900 years they were dispersed. But that specific generation, remember, that's the same generation that we've seen Jesus say several times that they were an evil and perverse generation. That generation that rejected him. That's the generation. These are the people that say his blood shall be on us and our children.
Rusty, do you believe that when it says our children, that it continues on our children's 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 children until they receive the Messiah?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
As in?
Yes. And of course, we've seen that historically.
Yes.
The pogroms,
Exactly.
You know, the Holocaust, and in many other countries they've been
Some
persecuted.
rockets fired at them right now.
Oh yeah,
There's never any rest from it.
yeah. And their greatest allies very weak at this point, politically.
Matthew
So-
doesn't say anything about Barabbas at all, other than he was named to be released.
Right.
But over in Mark 1840, it said, now Barabbas was a robber.
Yes. Yeah, and here, and I wished I had written more notes on that. You know, in verse 16, Matthew says he was a notorious prisoner. And I don't remember why, but there's something in that Greek word, either here or in one of the Gospels, that have led many to believe that it was more like almost like the Zealots, this always stirring up rebellion against the Jews. So, all right. So then it says, Jesus released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. And of course, the Romans carried out the execution, right? So, what does a scourge look like? I know y'all can tell me. And what would that have done to the body?
Rawhide or glass or metal or whatever, and it
Bone,
just rips you
all
apart.
kinds of stuff. Yeah. And from what I have read, in the beginning, it would bruise. Those things on the end would bruise. And then, of course, if you keep beating on a bruise, you know what happens, right? So again, I've still never watched the movie that Mel Gibson made, but some of you have probably seen it, and you say that it's probably accurate, to be honest. Yeah,
Probably not horrific enough.
right.
It's all that a person could stand.
Could handle.
You can't watch it
Look
without
at.
trying.
I bet not. I bet not.
Without trying.
Well, I've read that the Roman soldiers who carried those out prided themselves in being able to cleave flesh with theirs.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, MacArthur says that it lacerates the muscles, and oftentimes in a scourging, that it exposes the internal organs,
Wow.
and then they die from the
Then you gotta
scourging.
carry that cross up the hill.
Yeah.
Then you gotta breathe on the cross. And you
Yes.
gotta try. I can't stand
You're
it.
right. Yes, absolutely. That's the way it worked.
Can't stand it.
And King David wrote about, he described this type of punishment before it was ever invented in Psalm 22. And of course, it was prophetic beyond him to his son, Jesus, who would someday be crucified. All right. So, besides being scourged, which immediately he was in very poor shape physically, it says, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, and they gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him. Our guest talked about the fact that he wanted to go into the military, and how embarrassing it was, because he got to the very end, they tested his hearing and he couldn't go in. But he did have to experience the stripping off, and how embarrassing that was. That's embarrassing to anybody, I hope. I remember we used to have to semi-do that for sports. We'd have to have, what do you call it? Physicals. Yeah, physicals. And, that's embarrassing. When you grow up in a conservative home, that kind of thing is pretty embarrassing. And so Jesus is stripped of his clothes, and then they put a scarlet robe on him because they're making fun of him claiming to be a king, right? And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his hand, which represented obviously his scepter. And they knelt down before him and they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And why don't we have somebody read Isaiah 52:14? And somebody else read 1 Peter 2:23. Remember, sometimes we read Isaiah 53, that's kind of the well-known one, but actually 52 and 53 kind of fit together.
52, you want 52, 15?
52:14.
14. Just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Is that what you wanted?
Yes, yes. That's describing, remember the latter part, for starting in chapter 40 of Isaiah, all the way through, I don't remember what chapter, it's beyond 53, maybe 54, is called a servant song, and it's all about the servant of the Lord. Sometimes in the context, the servant of the Lord is talking about Israel itself, and sometimes it is talking about the Messiah. And this is talking about the Messiah.
What
Yes.
was in 53, what chapter? 53 what?
No, First Peter 2:23.
You also said something about Isaiah 50.
Yeah, she read Isaiah 52:14. 52:14.
And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously.
Yes. Absolutely. So it says they spat on him. You ever been spit on by somebody? I mean, other than your brother. You know, that doesn't count. We all got that. you know.
Or your kid.
Or your kid, yeah. It's pretty humiliating, right? Pretty, yeah, I bet not. Didn't end well for the other guy, did it? Pretty humiliating. And it says they took the reed and they began to beat him on the head. What would that do?
Pushing that crown.
Yes.
Into his skull.
And I'm assuming that probably they're talking about a reed like the reeds along the Nile that you get papyrus out of, or those may even grow along the Jordan River. I don't know, but you're talking about it's kind of like this stuff. I don't even remember what you call it, but it grows along creeks and lakes even around here
Like bamboo?
that get pretty, not bamboo, but it's something similar. It's a cane type stuff. So you're not talking about like a piece of grass, real flexible. You're talking about something that's pretty stiff and hard on top of those thorns. So after they mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and they put his own garments back on him, and they led him away to crucify him. And as they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene, which is North Africa, named Simon. And I'm sure Simon was there for the Passover. In fact, if I remember right, in Acts chapter 2 for Pentecost, there were people there from Cyrene. So there were Jewish communities in North Africa and Syria and all those places. That's where all of those people came from that came back to Pentecost. And so whom they pressed into service to bear his cross. Again, the studies that I've done, they say that this was the beam, or no. Yes, this would have been the beam that went across, the cross beam. So that would tell me that at this point, probably Jesus was so weak from the beating that he had taken and the blood loss and all that type of thing, that he simply physically could not carry it. And so, how would you like to be in that position? You know, it reminds me of that old song of probably the 80s about the Watch the Lamb. Y'all remember that song?
Mm-hmm.
Was that that was the guy that actually came out of the closet as a homosexual? Ray Boltz. Yes. So, if y'all didn't know that, I'm sorry that I let you know that. You remember going up there and watching him?
I saw him, yes. and
Yes.
what
A bunch
he
from
has
our
such a
church.
testimony.
Oh, he has incredible songwriting ability. the anchor holds and all that stuff. Remember we saw him up there in Arlington or somewhere. And after that, he came out of the closet as a homosexual. Anyway, that's off topic, isn't it? Okay. All right. So, so we're going to stop there. We're going to stop there. We got 5 minutes. I think you know, in the book of Isaiah, as it talks about this suffering servant, starting in 52 and going into chapter 53. You know, it talks about his suffering, and as all of that is described, what he will do. One of the verses that always that a lot of people don't get to as they're reading Isaiah 53, they read those first verses because a lot of the first verses are actually quoted in the New Testament, right? But in Isaiah, and we'll talk about this much more next time, in Isaiah 53,
4 through
verse 11 says this, because Jesus is, we're talking about his physical suffering now, right? But we're going to talk about his spiritual suffering as well that he experienced. And in Isaiah 53, it says this in verse 11, as a result of the anguish of his soul. So it is good and proper, I think, for us to understand how much he physically suffered for us, obviously. But sometimes people focus on that and don't think about the spiritual anguish, as Isaiah says, of his soul, as we see next time and go over the fact that we have a situation that is inexplicable by human beings. The fact that he became sin for us, in the sense of he became the sin bearer, the sacrifice of the sin of the world. As a holy God who must punish every single sin that humanity ever committed, took and placed that sin on Christ. And because of that, a holy Father had to turn away. I mean, even that's using, anthropomorphic type language. Had to turn away in the sense of some kind of serious effect between the fellowship of the Father and the Son. I can't tell you any more than that because we don't understand. I don't think we ever will. But when Isaiah, through inspiration, describes that situation as the anguish of the soul, and I believe that is primarily what Jesus was contemplating in the Garden of Gethsemane. Not so much the physical, even though he was fully human, so that had to affect him some. I'm not one of these that's all one or all the other, but primarily when you have the Son of God who lived in perfect fellowship with the Father and the Spirit eternally until that point, and then that fellowship is broken for a time. And again, I'm speaking human terms because I don't know any other terms. Apparently it was about 3 hours, and we'll look at that next time. And so this is what Isaiah wrote. He said, as a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it, talking about the Father will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many as he will bear their iniquities. And of course, the New Testament says that many times in different ways. But this was the great burden that Jesus carried. The taking of sin by a holy person. Remember, he was called the Holy One of Israel. From his humanity, he was sinless. He had never experienced sin. He had certainly experienced suffering, right? I mean, Isaiah says he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief from a human standpoint. But spiritually, this kind of suffering, we don't understand and we never will understand. But we certainly understand that he did something that no one else could do. I mean, God had to solve God's problem. And this is, to understand this is to understand why Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by me." If you understand this theological perspective, you understand that no, there's all faiths don't lead to God. There is nothing else that leads to God. Because nothing else could provide, no other religion, no other work, nothing could provide a perfect, sinless sacrifice other than God himself. And so he suffered, he had the anguish of the soul as he took on sin, and the Father turned away from him. And we'll look at that more next week. All right. Jonathan, can you close us with a word of prayer, please, sir?
Lord, thank you for